I wanted to tell the Irish side of the story. Enough had been written and said and promoted in films about the British side of the story, and I wanted to tell the Irish side of the story.
I think to the extent that this film was amongst the first of its kind in using almost exclusively archive footage and stills, that it was a statement of ambition.
People in 1959 mightn't have had that many visual images of 1916. They would have seen pictures of Pearse and some of the leaders, and because they would have been in history books, they would have been sometimes hanging up in places. But so I think one thing that Mise Éire would have done would have given people a much greater visual sense of Dublin, of mass meetings, of volunteers marching, of the GPO after the destruction after the Rising, those kind of things.
Mise Éire was Ireland's first major documentary film. Released in 1959 to an unprecedented level of popularity among the Irish public, the documentary charts the Irish struggle for independence, focusing on the years 1893 to 1918. The film's director, George Morrison, brought his audience on a visually compelling and emotionally charged journey through the Irish fight for freedom from the British Empire. The pivotal scenes of Mise Éire centred on the failed rebellion of 1916. Despite military disaster, the rising and subsequent execution of rebel leaders inspired a swell of nationalistic pride, eventually resulting in a 26-county Ireland gaining its independence from Great Britain. Emerging from an economic depression, the nation was primed to welcome this romanticised telling of its recent history, which promised to bolster national pride.
Well, I think one of the things that the film achieved was to restore or to create in a way a coherent moving picture narrative of the final decades before independence, and drew on a range of archival sources, mostly indeed originating in Britain, but to tell essentially a nationalist story. So in that sort of sense, it was seen as a great recuperation of Irish history in a way that the written record was not able to achieve.
Mise Éire was narrated entirely in the Irish language, a point of policy for production by financial backers Goy Lynn. Through Sean McRamon's poetic narration, a near mythological picture of Irish history was painted. Though a lot of people would have had little or no understanding of the words used, the sweeping orchestral score by Sean O'Reilly set the tone for the film.
Its primary influence for people like me, I think, was that its music became synonymous with a sense of the majesty of Irish traditional music, and O'Reilly became, well, certainly to my generation, a name that was revered.
The art of music comes the closest to the art of the motion picture arts because it takes time into consideration.
I would certainly say, though, that the use, not only the music itself and the scores, but also the actual use and timing of the music at different points, and the use of rhythm made a significant impact on the audience anticipation of what was going to happen. And also then after that, when at times, when the prisoners were let out and they were coming back to
When the 50th anniversary of the Rising was celebrated, the nationalism reflected in Mise Éire was already beginning to evolve. A more self-confident, self-assured and economically successful Ireland was on display at the commemorations.
The whole thing was to say, yes, we've had this rebellion, we are now a successful modern state, and you know, the message of 1966 is we have succeeded, look how far we have come, we are now a modern, successful state and nation, and we are looking into the future, and in the future we are going to do more. And an awful lot of 1966 was forward looking. If you were to try and spell out the national mission in 1966, it's to improve people's living standards, improve their opportunities for education, get Ireland into the E.C., and build better relationships with Northern Ireland.
Public reaction was profoundly changed and continues to evolve, with the various views of the morality of the 1916 Rising being presented.
Well, to a certain extent it was bound to mirror the intellectual crisis of the 70s and 80s, in which there was a revisionist, capital R, challenge to conventional and consensual understandings of the nationalist and republican tradition, clearly triggered by the spectacle of northern violence and the claims of the provisional IRA to be the direct inheritors of that tradition. It provoked a kind of ethical crisis in the understanding of history, and people had to question themselves as to whether, in lending their sympathy to that tradition, they were also sanctioning the kinds of events that were going on in Northern Ireland.
Different people at different times have different reactions to 1916, and these things come and go in waves. There was a cliche that 1916 became an unquestioning manifestation of patriotism, and that the people who did it are beyond reproach, and that everything about it was a glorious manifestation of all it's good to be Irish. That's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, there is the view that these were a bunch of disconnected people who, even within leftist theorists, who did the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Economic highs and lows have bolstered and destroyed Irish egos at different points in the last half-century. This has been particularly evident in recent years and has further complicated Ireland's relationship with its past, with unprecedented levels of wealth and subsequent economic hardship.
Enormous prices were being achieved by Republican memorabilia right through the period of the Celtic Tiger. And you might then ask, well, why was that going on? Well, my answer to it is that there was a phenomenon that I called Republican chic taking place, which was that an awful lot of the guys who were getting very, very wealthy somehow saw themselves as the realizers of the kind of republic that Pearse had dreamed of. But of course, that all proved ultimately to be a kind of a self-indulgent illusion in 2008, when the whole thing just basically imploded. And now there's a much more troubled questioning going on as we head into 2016.
The approaching centenary of 1916 promises a variety of new artistic representations. Films in production for 2016 are sure to differ from Mise Éire, allowing for a broader spectrum of opinions reflecting those that evolved over the last 50 years.
All the techniques that are available are, firstly, there's the material that we've seen in Mise Éire, the expert analysis of historians who have thought long and hard and discussed this long and hard. There are the audiovisual techniques that are available to us in the 21st century that weren't available to George Morrison at the time. And there's also, hopefully, a different sense of perspective, which would allow us to look at 1916 not as a single isolated incident in Dublin, but rather as part of a view of what was happening in the world at the time.
I think if you were doing it today, you'd probably, in your photographs, focus a bit more on the lives of ordinary people. I think what you'd see is a much wider lens, and I don't think it would be done in any way a disparaging, dismissive story, but I think the focus would be broader.
The type of what I would say a fairly simple nationalist narrative in relation to the events of the struggle for independence would be certainly considerably modified in a contemporary film to take account of what is called the two competing traditions on the island of Ireland.
I think that the music would have to in some way reflect something a little bit more dissonant or atonal in our understanding of these things today, because there isn't any longer that unbroken consensus about the meaning of 1916 to 23.
So is it time for the new Mise Éire, or maybe it's a time for a Virginia era. We are Ireland. We now do have our community. We have built our values. We can stand up with the world. We can stand up with Europe. We are recognised as a significant player on the world stage. So why not a world player?